The cartographer's hand trembled as he labeled the vast territory stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Tartaria, he wrote in careful script across what would become the largest landmass on any European map of the 18th century. Within 100 years, that name would vanish completely. Not gradually, not through conquest or natural evolution of language. It simply disappeared, as if 6 centuries of map-making had been a collective mistake. I wasn't looking for this. I was cataloging early modern European maps for a university archive, cross-referencing toponyms, checking consistency. Standard academic work, the kind where you expect small variations, spelling changes, regional preferences. What I found instead was something that still makes me second-guess my own observations. Between 1820 and 1850, every major cartographic institution in Europe simultaneously stopped using a place name that had appeared on virtually every map of Asia for the previous 600 years. No explanation, no transition period, no footnotes in the historical record explaining why the single, most prominently labeled region on their maps simply ceased to exist in their documentation. Pull up any comprehensive map of Asia from 1570 to 1800, you'll find it. Tartaria, or Tartary in Latin, sprawling across the continent in elaborate calligraphy. Abraham Ortelius's groundbreaking 1570 Theatrum Orbis Terrarum dedicates an entire plate to it. Guillaume Delisle's 1707 masterwork shows subdivisions: independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Muscovite Tartary. By 1780, Zata's detailed cartographic surveys mark it with the precision reserved for established empires. These weren't decorative flourishes, these were serious geographical works, created by the finest minds of their era, submitted to royal geographical societies, used for navigation and trade and military planning. Then, sometime after 1820, it's gone, not replaced gradually by modern names, gone, as if it had never been there at all. Now I know what you're thinking. Place names change, empires fall, territories get renamed. Constantinople becomes Istanbul, Persia becomes Iran. But those transitions leave traces, treaties, historical accounts, explanations in geographic texts about why the terminology shifted. Where's the equivalent for Tartaria? Where's the scholarly paper explaining the nomenclature change, the diplomatic correspondence, the historical moment when European cartographers collectively decided to stop using a term that had defined Asian geography for centuries? I couldn't find it, and maybe that's where I should have stopped. Maybe that's where any reasonable researcher would have stopped. But there was something about the cleanliness of the erasure that bothered me. So I started looking at other records from the same period: census data, architectural surveys, municipal records. And that's when the pattern started to feel less like historical coincidence and more like something else entirely.
Consider the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. The White City, they called it. Nearly 200 buildings, sprawling across 690 acres, constructed in less than 3 years. Neoclassical palaces with 60-foot cornices, perfect architectural unity, structures so impressive that one visitor wrote they represented perhaps the most flawless creation on a large scale of man's invention. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts building alone covered 30 acres under a single roof. The Palace of Fine Arts featured such elaborate classical detailing that nations insisted it be fireproof before they'd display their art inside. These buildings hosted 27 million visitors over 6 months. They were photographed extensively, documented in newspapers, described in journals. They were real. They existed. People walked through them, marveled at them, wrote home about them. Then they were demolished. All of them. Well, almost all. The official explanation? They were temporary structures built from staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and jute fiber, never intended to last. Built cheap, painted white to look like marble, designed to be torn down after the fair ended. The entire massive complex, with all its architectural sophistication, was apparently constructed with the sole purpose of existing for 6 months and then being destroyed.
Now, I'm not an architect, I'm a researcher who stumbled into this, but I started looking at construction timelines. In 1890, Chicago had a population of just over 1 million. The exposition grounds weren't in developed areas, they were in Jackson Park, which required extensive preparation. The soil needed stabilization, lagoons had to be dredged, infrastructure had to be installed, and then, in less than 3 years, builders erected nearly 200 elaborate structures, each one detailed enough to fool visitors into thinking they were looking at permanent marble buildings rather than painted plaster. The lead architect, Daniel Burnham, became legendary for this achievement. But when you read his letters, his notes, his records from that period, what's striking is how little detail exists about the actual construction process. We have exhaustive documentation of the fair itself, thousands of photographs, detailed descriptions, visitor accounts. But the architectural plans, the construction records, the engineering specifications that would have been essential for such a massive undertaking, surprisingly sparse, enough to establish that yes, buildings were built, not quite enough to reconstruct exactly how such elaborate structures were erected so quickly with the technology and labor force available in 1890. And Chicago wasn't unique. The 1889 Paris Exposition Universelle, the 1851 Crystal Palace in London, the 1873 Vienna World's Fair. Look at photographs of these events. Massive, elaborate, architecturally sophisticated structures, all built rapidly, all documented extensively during their brief existence, all demolished thoroughly afterward. The pattern repeats across dozens of World's Fairs throughout the 19th century. Perhaps this is all perfectly normal. Perhaps 19th century builders possessed construction capabilities that seem remarkable only because we've forgotten the techniques they used. Perhaps there's no connection between the architectural mysteries of these fairs and the cartographic mysteries of Tartaria's disappearance. Certainly, that's the reasonable conclusion.
But then I started looking at city records from the same period, and I found something else. In the 1870s and 1880s, major cities across America began conducting comprehensive surveys of their building stock. Chicago, San Francisco, Boston, New York. The survey has documented construction dates, architectural styles, materials used. And buried in these records, I found something odd. In city after city, there are buildings, substantial structures, government buildings, banks, hotels, whose construction dates are listed vaguely or contradictorily. Circa 1860s, built approximately 1850. Construction date uncertain. Not for small structures, for major municipal buildings, the kind of construction that should have required permits, architectural plans, public records. In San Francisco, several prominent buildings in the financial district show construction dates that place their completion before the gold rush, despite architectural styles that match late 19th century techniques. The records acknowledge this inconsistency in footnotes, usually with phrases like "records unclear" or "original documentation lost in fire." San Francisco did have a major earthquake and fire in 1906, that's well documented, but these discrepancies appear in survey records from the 1880s, before the fire that's supposed to explain the missing documentation. Chicago provides another example. After the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, the city famously rebuilt rapidly, and indeed the construction boom is well documented. But several structures that appear in pre-fire photographs and survive the fire show ambiguous construction dates in municipal records. They existed before 1871, they still exist now, but the records from the 1880s list their construction dates with unusual vagueness for buildings that should have been part of the city's documented history. I want to be clear here, I'm not making claims. I'm describing what I found in city archives. Maybe there are perfectly reasonable explanations for these inconsistencies. Maybe 19th century record-keeping was simply less precise than we assume. Maybe fires and disasters destroyed more documentation than we realize. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But there's one more thing, something I almost didn't include because it feels too strange, too easy to dismiss. Languages shift over time, that's normal. Words change meaning, pronunciation evolves, regional dialects develop. But what if I told you that certain architectural terms, certain technical vocabularies seem to have undergone unusually rapid transformation in the early to mid-19th century? terms for construction techniques, for building styles, for engineering methods. Not a gradual evolution, an abrupt shift where entire technical vocabularies were replaced with new ones in the span of a few decades. I found this while researching construction manuals from the period. A building technique described in detail in an 1810 manual is referred to by an entirely different name in an 1860 manual, even though the technique itself appears unchanged. The later manual doesn't reference the earlier terminology, doesn't explain why the names changed. It simply uses different words for the same concepts, as if the previous vocabulary had never existed.
This happens occasionally in technical fields. New discoveries lead to new nomenclature. Scientific understanding improves and old terms become obsolete. But usually you can trace the transition. You can find the moment when someone said, "We should call this X instead of Y, and here's why." For this particular cluster of architectural terms, that transition point doesn't seem to exist. The vocabulary simply changed, and everyone moved forward as if the old terms had been a mistake all along. Now, bring all of this together. Maps that show an enormous territory for centuries and then stop showing it with no explanation. World's fairs featuring massive architectural achievements that were supposedly built to be temporary and then meticulously demolished. City building records from the same period showing unusual gaps and inconsistencies. Technical vocabularies undergoing abrupt, unexplained changes. None of this proves anything. Each individual piece can be explained away. Historical records are always incomplete. Maps change, buildings get demolished, languages evolve. But when you look at all of it together, when you see the pattern across multiple types of evidence, across different continents, across several decades of the 19th century, it starts to feel like something happened. Not something dramatic, not some conspiracy, but something that altered how we recorded, described, and remembered a particular period of architectural and geographical history. There's one more element that I haven't mentioned yet, one more piece of this pattern that appeared in my research, and it's the piece that made me question whether I should publish any of this at all. In genealogical records from European royal families in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, there are gaps. Not dramatic absences, not missing generations, just vagueness, where detailed records should exist about maternal lineages, about marriages that consolidated power across borders. The documentation becomes surprisingly sparse. Women appear in family trees, marry into established dynasties, and their own ancestries are listed with unusual brevity. Minor mobility, distant relations, German principalities. This is strange because these royal families were obsessed with bloodline documentation. Marriage alliances were political negotiations that required extensive proof of lineage. Yet in several major European dynasties from this specific period, the maternal lines become remarkably vague right around the time that Tartaria disappears from maps. The official records exist, marriage certificates, birth announcements, but the deeper ancestry, the connections that should have been documented meticulously, are listed with phrases like origins uncertain or ancestry undocumented. The Romanovs provide one example. The official history traces their line back through the Rurik dynasty, clean succession, well documented, except for certain marriages in the late 1700s where the bride's own ancestry becomes oddly ambiguous. Academic footnotes mention possible Tartar connections in certain noble lines, not Mongolian, Tartar, that specific word. And then those footnotes never expand into full discussions. They exist as scholarly whispers, acknowledged but never explored.
Look at the House of Hanover, imported to Britain in 1714. Protestant succession, parliamentary approval, all properly documented. But several of the German principalities these royals came from show their own recent dynastic changes in the records. New families, new names, new heraldry, all within a generation or two of being called upon to provide British monarchs. The transitions are noted in genealogical records, but the details of those transitions, the explanations for why these particular families rose to prominence precisely when needed, remain curiously underdocumented. Again, maybe this is normal. Maybe royal genealogies from this period are always vague about maternal lines. Maybe the documentation standards we expect simply didn't exist then. Maybe I'm reading significance into historical gaps that simply reflect the casual record-keeping of the era.
But here's what troubles me. When you look at royal genealogies from the same families 50 years earlier or 50 years later, the documentation is meticulous, extensive records, detailed ancestry, thorough verification. It's specifically this period, roughly 1750 to 1850, where the vagueness appears, the same century where Tartaria vanishes from maps, the same century where enormous architectural achievements get rapidly built and demolished, the same century where technical vocabularies shift and city records become ambiguous. I've shown this research to colleagues. The response is always the same. Interesting observations, probably coincidental, historical records are messy, don't read too much into gaps and inconsistencies. And they're probably right. This is likely all confirmation bias, the human tendency to see patterns where none exist, to find connections between unrelated phenomena. But I can't stop thinking about those maps, about the way Tartaria simply vanished, about how thoroughly it disappeared, as if 6 centuries of cartography had been collectively mistaken, about how that disappearance coincided with all these other subtle shifts in how we documented, built, and remembered our architectural and genealogical past. You can verify all of this yourself. The maps are in library archives, digitized and available online. The World's Fair photographs are extensively documented. The city building records are public. The genealogical archives are accessible to researchers. I'm not asking you to believe anything. I'm asking you to look at the same evidence I looked at and decide for yourself what you see. Maybe you'll see exactly what the historical consensus suggests: normal gaps in historical documentation, standard evolution of cartographic conventions, reasonable explanations for architectural choices, typical vagueness in old genealogical records. Maybe you'll conclude that I've spent too much time in archives, seeing significance in the ordinary messiness of historical evidence. Or maybe you'll see what I saw: a pattern, a consistency to the gaps, a thoroughness to certain erasures that feels less like historical accident and more like historical intention. Not a conspiracy, not some grand cover-up, just a systematic, quiet removal of certain elements from
Our documented past, done thoroughly enough that we stopped asking why a territory that occupied a third of every Asian map for 600 years simply ceased to exist in our records. I don't have answers, I have questions, and those questions led me to more questions, which led me to patterns I can't fully explain. The maps don't lie about what was there. The photographs from the World's Fairs don't lie about what was built. The genealogical records don't lie about the gaps they contain. These are historical facts, documented and verifiable. What we make of those facts, what explanations we accept for the patterns they create, that's where things get complicated. That's where I find myself uncertain, questioning my own observations, wondering if I'm seeing something real or simply projecting meaning onto the random noise of incomplete historical data. But I keep coming back to those maps, to that name, written so carefully across so much territory for so long, to the question that started all of this: where did Tartaria go? Not how did the name change, not why did the terminology evolve, but where did it go? Because it didn't fade gradually, it didn't transition into modern names, it didn't leave explanatory notes in historical texts. It simply disappeared. Completely, thoroughly, as if it had never been there at all. And maybe that's the answer. Maybe it never was there, not in the way the maps suggested. Maybe Tartaria was always a European misconception, a cartographic placeholder for regions they didn't understand, and the 19th century simply corrected that error. That's the reasonable explanation, that's what the historical consensus suggests, and maybe that's exactly right. But if that's the case, then why don't the historical records say so? Why isn't there documentation explaining the correction? Why don't the cartographic texts from the period discuss why they're removing this massive label from their maps? Why is the disappearance so clean, so thorough, so completely undiscussed in the very records that should explain it? I'm a researcher. I work with historical evidence, and the evidence says that for 6 centuries, European cartographers believed or claimed that this enormous territory called Tartaria existed. Then, in a historically brief period, they stopped believing it or claiming it, and they left almost no explanation for why. That absence of explanation is itself a kind of evidence. It's evidence of something. I'm just not entirely sure what.